From the moment I bought my house, I knew that the HOA didn't like me. Not because I was a bad neighbor, not because my house was a problem, but because I refused to bend to their rules. The community where I lived had those typical neighborhood associations that love to meddle in other people's lives. Absurd fees, nonsensical rules, regulations that changed according to the will of the HOA president. I didn't sign anything. My house was legally out of their jurisdiction, but that didn't stop them from trying. First, there were the letters, a bunch of paperwork, inviting me to join the HOA, as if it were a great privilege to pay hundreds of dollars a month to be told what color my fence should be. Then the visits began. The president of the HOA, a woman who spoke with a sweet tone but had a cutting gaze, showed up at my door more than once trying to convince me. You know, all the residents here contribute to maintaining the harmony of the community. Wouldn't you like to be part of that? I already knew where this was going. I've seen these kinds of people for years in court. People who think they're little backyard dictators, who think they can force others to obey just because no one has had the courage to stand up to them. I always refused. And that's when it started to get personal. I was getting fines from the HOA for rules that didn't even apply to me. My garbage was mysteriously not collected. Once, I woke up to a tow truck taking my car out of the garage for illegal parking. There was always something trying to irritate me, to wear me down, to force me to give in, but I never gave in. And then the fire came. It was an ordinary evening. I was at home, relaxing after a long day in court, when I smelled it. Burning. Smoke. I jumped up, and as soon as I reached the door, I saw the flames. My house was on fire. The shock only lasted a few seconds before instinct kicked in. I left immediately, calling the fire department while trying to understand what was happening. The fire was already spreading fast, consuming everything, destroying years of my life in a matter of minutes. By the time the fire department arrived, it was too late. They managed to put out the fire, but my house was completely destroyed. And there, on the sidewalk, watching it all with her arms crossed, was her, the president of the HOA. There was no surprise on her face. There was no worry, no shock, just a cold, satisfied look. And it was there, in the midst of the smoke and ashes, that I understood what had happened. They were no longer playing dirty. They had crossed the line. What didn't they know? I was the most feared judge in the state, and now they were going to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong person. I stood there, watching the firefighters finish their work. The smell of burning wood permeated everything. The place where I used to live, where I had invested time, money, and memories, was now just a pile of ashes and smoldering debris. But I didn't feel despair. I didn't feel grief. What I felt was a cold, calculated rage. The kind of anger that doesn't explode. It only grows. And in the midst of all this, the woman from the HOA was watching me with her arms crossed. Her expression said it all. There was no pity, no shock. She knew. The police arrived soon after the fire department. Of course, a fire like this needed an investigation. I approached the policeman in charge, a man who seemed to have seen many disasters like this before. "Everything indicates that the fire started on the side of the house," he said, leafing through a notepad. "We're going to investigate whether it was arson. Did you notice anything strange before the fire?" I looked directly at the woman from the HOA. She was still there, listening to everything. But when she saw my gaze, she turned her face away and began to walk away, pretending it wasn't about her. "I have some suspicions," I replied calmly, "and I'm sure you'll find enough evidence to confirm them." The truth? I already knew it was arson. The HOA had been pressuring me for months to join the association. They had already tried fake fines. They had already made my life difficult in every possible way. When they realized that none of this was working, they resorted to destruction. They burned down my house to intimidate me. The problem? They chose the wrong victim. I knew exactly how to investigate a case like this. I'd spent years dealing with criminals who thought they could escape justice. I knew what the police would be looking for: what evidence was needed, what legal loopholes could be used against the HOA, and most importantly, I knew how to crush them. Over the next few days, I started to take action. Even without my house, I still had my car, my phone, and, above all, my influence. I went to the police station and asked for access to the preliminary report on the fire. The first analyses already indicated that the fire was not accidental. No electrical problems, no gas leaks. Someone had caused it. So I did my own investigation. I started by talking to neighbors. Some were neutral, but others were visibly uncomfortable when I asked if they had seen anything suspicious. Look, I don't want to pry, but I heard strange noises that night. One of them finally gave in, like footsteps, voices, as if someone was there, right next to your house. I just nodded. That was enough to start with. Now I needed the security recordings. Some houses in the neighborhood had cameras facing the street. I knew that if someone had approached my property that night, there would be a record. And I was right. After a few conversations, a neighbor gave me images that confirmed everything. There, in the dead of night, 3 people walking towards my house, their faces covered, cautious movements. And then, seconds later, the flash of flames. The icing on the cake? One of the figures had an unmistakable detail, a shiny necklace reflecting the light from the street, a necklace I'd seen before. The HOA was up to its neck in it, but I needed to tie up the ends before going on the attack. I returned to the police station with the recordings and presented everything to the investigator in charge. I think this could be useful in the investigation. The man watched the video carefully. At the end, he let out a long sigh and looked at me. "And do you have any idea who it might be?" I crossed my arms and gave a humorless smile. "I have a good suspicion." He nodded. From then on, the police began to treat the case as arson, with malicious intent. Now, it was only a matter of time. In the meantime, I needed to give the HOA a special gift. The woman didn't know it yet, but this was going to be the worst week of her life, and I was about to make sure of it. Over the next few days, the whole neighborhood seemed quieter. It wasn't the usual kind of silence, but one filled with tension, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen. The HOA must have already known that the police were investigating the fire as arson, but what they didn't know yet was that I already had all the pieces I needed to crush them. The first thing I did was call in some contacts. Being a federal judge wasn't just a nice title on paper, it meant I had access to a network of authorities who knew exactly how to deal with arrogant criminals who think they'll never be caught. In just a few phone calls, I was able to speed up the investigation into the HOA's money. I already knew that this woman loved to exert power over others, but now I wanted to know if, as well as being authoritarian, she was also corrupt. It didn't take long for irregularities to appear. Unrecorded expenses, fees that increased out of the blue without justification, and most interesting of all, suspicious transfers to a personal account, which, with a little more research, I discovered belonged to her husband. The woman who burned down my house to force me into the HOA was also stealing from her own neighbors. But before going for the final attack, I wanted to see her reaction when she realized she was cornered. That afternoon, I went to the HOA headquarters. It was a small building within the community where the meetings took place and where she and her cronies signed their idiotic rules. As soon as I entered, the buzz stopped. People looked at me as if they had seen a ghost. They knew that I had lost everything in that fire. They knew I wasn't there for a friendly chat. The woman was sitting behind a table trying to look calm, but her fingers drummed nervously on the wooden top. She knew I had reason to be there, and she knew that if I was there, it was because something was about to happen. She opened her mouth to speak, probably to make some comment about how I was coping with the loss of my house. But before she could say anything, I placed an envelope on the table. She stared at it for a second before pulling it close and opening it. Inside were copies of suspicious transactions, records of missing money, and some of the evidence I already had about the fire. She leafed through the papers, her face growing paler with each passing page. I stood there, watching the exact moment when arrogance turned to fear. She looked up at me and tried to regain her posture, but her voice came out weaker than I expected. What? What exactly do you want with this? I crossed my arms and gave a slight smile. Oh, I just wanted to give you the courtesy of seeing it before the police did. It was then that she knew there was no escape. The next day, the police knocked on her door, not just on suspicion of arson, but now also fraud and embezzlement. The HOA, which had once been feared by all the residents, was now imploding. Some members began to drift away, trying to pretend that they never had anything to do with it. Others tried to blame the woman alone, as if they hadn't benefited from her schemes. But the damage had already been done. By the end of that week, the local newspapers were covering the story. The headline was something like, HOA president investigated for fraud and possible involvement in arson. The whole neighborhood was watching her empire crumble, and the best part was that I didn't even have to lift a finger for it. I just laid the truth on the table and let the law do the rest. She tried to defend herself. She tried to play the victim. She tried to blame someone else, but no one wanted to listen. The very residents who had previously been afraid to contradict her now spoke openly about how she manipulated everything, how she used HOA fees to benefit herself, how she made the association an instrument of control. Everything that had been hidden finally came to light. And then came the best part, the fire. Forensics confirmed that the fire started with an accelerant on the side of the house, exactly where the cameras showed those 3 hooded people on the night of the incident. The police were already cracking down on those involved, and as I suspected, one of them couldn't take the pressure. An HOA employee, one of those doormats who did everything the woman told him to, confessed everything in exchange for a deal. He said that he had received direct orders from the president to solve the problem with me. He told how they waited for the right moment to act, and how they believed that, without a house, I would finally give in and join the HOA. They thought they were above the law, but they weren't above me. Now, with a confession and hard evidence, the case has been closed. She was arrested, and the neighborhood was finally free of that tyranny. The HOA, which had previously been an unquestioned entity, was dissolved. Residents were free from fees, absurd rules, and fear. Well, I stayed right where I was, because at the end of the day, they tried to destroy me. They tried to force me out. They tried to bend me, but all they managed to do was give me the perfect reason to finish them off once and for all. In the days following the arrest of the HOA president, the neighborhood seemed like a different place. The fear that had previously kept the residents submissive simply disappeared. There were no more threatening letters, ridiculous notifications, or mandatory meetings about what kind of plant was allowed in the gardens. For the first time in years, people were free. Well, I wasn't finished yet. The police had already done their bit by arresting the woman, but I wanted to make sure she never had the chance to get back on her feet. The arson was enough to put her behind bars, but the financial fraud she ran within the HOA would be the final blow. With the investigation underway, the HOA's bank accounts were frozen. The funds she embezzled were being traced, and residents were increasingly outraged to discover how much money she had stolen. I saw neighbors commenting on the street, furious, talking about how they paid absurd fees while she used that money to pay for expensive dinners and trips to luxury resorts. But the most satisfying detail came a few days later. One of the ex-members of the HOA, someone who used to walk with his head held high next to that woman, showed up on my doorstep. He was a middle-aged man, visibly uncomfortable, holding an envelope. "I wanted to give you this," he said, avoiding my gaze. I took the envelope and opened it. Inside were internal HOA documents, expense reports, decisions signed by the woman, concrete proof that she had been embezzling money for years. I looked up at him, waiting for an explanation. "I never agreed with everything she did," he continued, "but I was complicit. And now, I want to at least put it right. I knew he wasn't doing it out of a clear conscience. He was doing it because he could smell doom approaching, and wanted to jump ship before it sank for good. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that I now had the last proof I needed. The next day, I sent everything to the government investigators. With this new evidence, the case against the woman became even stronger. Now, in addition to arson, she would also be tried for fraud and embezzlement. The news spread quickly. Local newspapers covered the case. Headlines splashed her picture with words like embezzlement and organized crime at HOA. She, once the power figure of the community, was now the perfect example of how greed destroys everything. And then came the icing on the cake. With the HOA officially dissolved, her house was put up for sale to cover part of the compensation to the residents. She lost everything. The same neighbors who once feared her now openly commented on her ruin. Some felt sorry, others just said that she got what she deserved. I just carried on, because I knew that justice always comes in the end. My house was burned down. They tried to destroy me, but in the end, they were the only ones who ended up in ashes. And of course, don't forget to comment and leave your like to support more and more.